The history books tell you the American West was won by the Winchester rifle and the steel plow. They are lying to you. The Winchester was an expense, and the plow was a gamble that usually lost against the hardpan clay. The real economy of the plains wasn't built on gold, cattle, or wheat. It was built on calcium phosphate. Between 1868 and 1890, the prairie was an open-air graveyard, a chaotic mess of 30 million slaughtered bison left to rot in the sun. To the romantic, this was a tragedy. To the forensic accountant, it was an inventory management problem that transformed into a windfall. While the hide hunters took the skins and left the carcasses, a second wave of opportunists, men with zero romanticism and desperate bank ledgers, walked onto the stage. They didn't see skeletons, they saw fertilizer. They saw sugar refining agents. They saw $40 million, over $1.2 billion today, lying on the ground, waiting to be picked up. The myth of the self-sufficient homesteader crumbles when you look at the rainfall data for Kansas and Texas in the 1870s. The land was hostile. The soil was sod so thick it snapped iron blades. A family of 4 needed approximately $500 a year, about $15,000 today, just to buy the flour, coffee and seed corn necessary to stay alive while their first crop withered in the drought. Most didn't have it. The banks in St. Louis weren't lending to dirt farmers with no collateral, but the ground was white. From a distance, the plains didn't look like grass. They looked like snow. It was bone. Miles of it. A single bison skeleton weighs roughly 50 pounds when bleached dry. Multiply that by 30 million. You're looking at 1.5 billion pounds of raw industrial material. The homesteaders didn't survive by farming. They survived by becoming scavengers. They became bone pickers, the bottom feeders of the frontier economy who fueled the chemical industries of Detroit and Philadelphia. Go to Dodge City, Kansas, in the summer of 1874. Forget the saloon shootout. Look at the railway siding of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad. The temperature is 104 degrees. The humidity is non-existent. The smell, however, is a physical weight. It is the scent of old marrow and calcified death. Beside the track runs a rickety wooden platform, and next to that stands a pile of buffalo bones. This is not a haphazard heap. It is an engineered structure. The stack is 12 feet high, 20 feet wide, and stretches for half a mile down the track. It contains the remains of 60,000 animals. It represents 3,000 tons of freight. At the going rate of $8 per ton, roughly $250 today, that single pile is worth $750,000 in modern currency. The logistics of the bone trade were brutal and mathematically precise. The hide hunters had done the killing 3 years prior, stripping the skins for industrial leather belts in New England factories. They left the carcasses to the wolves and the weather. By the time the bone pickers arrived, the sun had bleached the skeleton's fight and the connective tissue had disintegrated. This was crucial. Green bones, those with meat or gristle still attached, were heavy and virtually worthless because the processors paid by the ton of usable phosphate, not water weight. The bone picker needed dry merchandise. A typical operation consisted of a man, a wagon, and a team of horses or oxen. The wagon was the limiting factor. A standard farm wagon could hold perhaps 2,000 pounds of bones if they were thrown in loosely. That is 1 ton. $8. To make the trip profitable, the pickers had to engineer the load. They built sideboards, wooden extensions on the wagon walls. To increase the volume, they learned to nest the bones. Ribs were shoveled into the gaps between femurs. Skulls, the heaviest and most awkward component, were used to build the perimeter walls of the load, facing inward to lock the pile together. A properly stacked wagon could carry 3,500 pounds. The geography of the harvest followed the railroad. This was a heavy freight industry. You could not haul a ton of bones 50 miles by wagon and make a profit. The caloric burn of the horses and the wear on the wooden axles ate the margin. The collection zone was a tight corridor, 10 to 20 miles either side of the tracks. As the Santa Fe and the Kansas Pacific laid steel further west, the bone pickers moved with them, a grim vanguard clearing the right-of-way. The economics were driven by the railroad's need for backhaul. Trains went west loaded with manufactured goods, stoves, lumber, rifles, whiskey. They returned east empty. An empty boxcar is a hemorrhage on a balance sheet. The railroad barons needed weight to justify the coal burned on the return trip. They dropped the freight rates for bones to rock bottom. This artificial subsidy is what made the industry possible. It connected the desolate production zone of the Texas Panhandle with the industrial consumption zone of the Midwest. The buyers were waiting in the east. This wasn't about decoration or museum pieces. This was chemistry. The primary destination for the best bones was the Michigan Carbon Works in Detroit or the Empire Carbon Works in St. Louis. These massive industrial complexes were hungry for calcium phosphate. There were two main markets. The first was fertilizer. The soil in the American South was exhausted. Decades of intensive cotton farming and tobacco cultivation had stripped the land of phosphorus. The cotton yields were plummeting. The plantation owners needed a recharge. The bison bones, ground into fine dust and treated with sulfuric acid, created superphosphate. The skeletons of the Great Plains were shipped 2,000 miles to resurrect the soil of Georgia and Alabama. It was a transfer of biological energy from the new frontier to the old aristocracy. The second market was sugar. The American appetite for refined white sugar was exploding. But raw sugar is brown and full of molasses. To make it white, you filter it through bone black, charred animal bones. The carbon structure of a burnt bison bone is incredibly porous. It traps impurities at a molecular level. The bone pickers of Kansas were directly fueling the confectionery industry of New York. Every cube of white sugar dropped into a teacup in Boston in 1880 had been filtered through the skull of a bison that died in the Arkansas River Valley. The process of gathering was distinct from the process of hunting. It was slow, grinding labor. A family would wake at 4 in the morning to beat the heat. They would drive the wagon out onto the prairie, scanning the grass for the white glint of calcium. The father would walk one side, the children the other. When they found a stand, a place where a herd had been slaughtered in a group, it was a gold mine. A sharpshooter with a 50-90 Sharps rifle could drop 50 animals in a single stand without moving his position. For the bone picker, this meant 50 skeletons in a 50-yard radius. 2.5 tons, $20, $600 today, a week's wages in an hour, but usually the bones were scattered. The pickers had to drag them. They carried iron hooks to pull ribs out of the sod. They had to watch for rattlesnakes, which loved to coil inside the empty rib cages for shade. A bite meant death or amputation, which meant the loss of a laborer, which meant the loss of the margin. They wore thick leather gloves, not for safety, but because the sun-bleached bone was abrasive enough to sand the skin off a human hand in an afternoon. The friction in the system came from the rapid depletion of the resource. A bison doesn't grow back. Once the skeleton is gone, the land is empty. By 1878, the easy pickings near the railheads in Kansas were gone. The pickers had to push further out, 20 or 30 miles. This changed the math. The wagon trips took 2 days instead of 1. They had to carry water for the horses. The profit per ton dropped because the overhead increased. This scarcity led to the bone wars. It wasn't a war with guns, usually. It was a war of theft. A picker would stack a pile of bones on the open prairie, marking it with a stake, intending to come back with a wagon. When he returned 3 days later, the pile would be gone. Competitors would shadow each other, watching for the dust trails of wagons, swooping in to claim a stand that someone else had scouted. The Native American tribes viewed this with a complex mixture of pragmatism and horror. The bison were their relatives, spiritually and physically. Seeing the bones carted off was a final desecration. However, the tribes were also starving. The government rations were insufficient and often stolen by corrupt Indian agents. The Comanche and the Kiowa entered the bone trade. They gathered the remains of the herds they had once hunted, trading them at the railhead for flour and coffee. It was a dark irony, selling the bones of their culture to buy the food of their conquerors. In 1881, the Texas and Pacific Railway laid tracks through Sweetwater, Texas. This opened up the southern herd's graveyard. The scale here was even larger. The slaughter in Texas had been more concentrated. The bone piles in Sweetwater became legendary. Reports from the era describe walls of bones along the tracks that acted as windbreaks. Let's look at the numbers from a single year. In 1884, the Kansas shipping records show that over 2 million tons of bones were moved east. That number is staggering. It implies the collection of the remains of millions of animals in a 12-month period. The cash injection into the local economy was massive. In lean years, when the corn burned up in July, the bone money was the only thing that kept the general stores open. It paid the mortgages. It bought the seed for the next year. The escalation of the industry birthed a specialized class of middlemen, the bone buyer. These men set up shop at the sidings. They paid the pickers in cash or store credit, then negotiated the bulk rates with the railroad. They were the arbitrageurs. They knew the price of phosphate in Baltimore and the price of freight in Dodge. They squeezed the pickers for pennies. A picker might get $6 a ton while the buyer sold it for $12 in St. Louis. The picker took the risk of the snakes, the heat, and the crushed fingers. The buyer took the risk of the market. The climax of the bone era came swiftly. It was a resource extraction curve that went vertical and then crashed. By the late 1880s, the plains were picked clean. You could ride from Fort Worth to Dodge City and not see a single skull. The great white pile was gone. The pickers, desperate for the easy money to continue, began to dig. They looked for old wallows where bison might have died in mud and been buried. They dug up fresh bones, which the processors hated because of the grease. They even raided shallow settler graves or Native American burial mounds, tossing human femurs into the mix. A bone is a bone when it's ground into powder. The buyers turned a blind eye. The aftermath was a silent prairie. The biological cover was gone. Those millions of skeletons had served a purpose in the ecosystem. As they slowly decayed over decades, they would have released calcium and phosphorus back into the soil, feeding the grass that held the dirt in place. By shipping the bones to Georgia and Pennsylvania, the pickers were stripping the Great Plains of its long-term nutrients. They were exporting the fertility of the West. When the bones were gone, the pickers had to go back to farming. But the drought cycle returned in the 1890s. This time, there was no backup income. The starvation was real. The economic buffer that the skeletons provided had been spent. The families that had survived 1874 by selling skulls went bankrupt in 1894. They packed their wagons and moved on, or they starved. The legacy of the bone trade is visible if you know where to look. It is in the soil analysis of the Deep South, where high phosphorus levels date back to the late 19th century. Ghost signatures of the bison. It is in the old brickwork of the sugar refineries in Detroit, built on the profits of carbon black. Most importantly, it is in the narrative of the West itself. We like to think of the frontier as a place of creation, building barns, planting crops, founding towns. But the first true industry of the American West was an industry of liquidation. It was a salvage operation. The settlers didn't tame the land. They stripped it for parts. They sold the biological history of the continent for $8 a ton to keep the lights on. Consider the Michigan Carbon Works, founded in 1803 by Deming Jarvis. He saw the piles of bones and realized the inefficiency of the current market. He built a factory in Detroit that became the largest single industry in the city before the automobile. He processed 20,000 tons of bones annually. He made glue, fertilizer, and neat's foot oil. His fortune was built on the removal of the bison. The company eventually merged and morphed, its DNA winding into the modern chemical conglomerates. The bone business also standardized the specific gravity of freight. The railroads learned how to weigh bulk biological matter because of the bison. The scales at the depots in Kansas were calibrated to the buffalo. The logic of the ton-mile, the cost to move 1 ton 1 mile, was refined on these skeletons. There is a specific account from a homesteader named John Cook in 1877. He noted that in the path of the great slaughter for miles, one could jump from carcass to carcass without touching the ground. 3 years later, Cook returned to the same spot. It was clean. Not a vertebrae remained. It was as if a vacuum had passed over the land. This total erasure fueled the myth that the bison simply vanished. Settlers arriving in 1900 saw green grass and assumed it had always been empty. They didn't see the boneyard because it had been bagged, tagged, and shipped. The physical evidence of the genocide wasn't buried. It was chemically transformed and eaten. The fertilizer produced was potent. Bone superphosphate appeared in seed catalogs in the 1880s. It was marketed as a miracle cure for tired soil. A farmer in Virginia would spread the dust of a Texas bison over his tobacco field. The tobacco grew tall. The farmer sold the tobacco to buy sugar. The sugar was refined using the charred ribs of the same bison herd. The economy was a closed loop of consumption, driven by the liquidation of the wild. Let's break down the chemistry of the money. A ton of bones yielded about 300 pounds of bone ash. That ash was roughly 80% tricalcium phosphate. In 1880, tricalcium phosphate was the gold standard for agricultural chemistry. The demand was infinite. The supply was finite. This created a pricing bubble. In 1872, bones were $3 a ton. By 1880, they hit $10. In the drought of 1890, when the supply was nearly gone, buyers offered $20 for prime dry, but there were no takers. The inventory was zero. The psychological toll on the pickers was documented in journals. It was grim work. They were surrounded by death constantly. The sound of the wind whistling through the rib cages was a trope in prairie literature for a reason. It was real. The landscape was a memento mori. Yet the ledger ruled. A man might weep for the beauty of the lost herd, but he would still smash the school to fit it into the wagon bed because their pockets didn't pay. The bone pickers also gathered horns. The horns were separate from the bone trade. They were keratin, not calcium. They were shipped to manufacturing centers to be turned into buttons, combs, and knife handles. Before bakelite and plastic, there was buffalo horn. The buttons on the coats of bankers in London in 1885 were punched from the horns of animals killed in the Texas Panhandle. Even the hooves were taken, they were boiled down for glue. Mucilage was the term. The binding agent for books, furniture, and wallpaper in the Victorian era came from the collagen of the bison. The very books that recorded the history of the West were bound with the glue rendered from its destruction. The collection process had an end point. By 1900, the industry was dead. The railroad stopped offering the bone rates. The sidings in Dodge and Sweetwater were cleared. The bone pickers vanished into history, rebranded as failed farmers or drifting laborers. The millions of dollars in profit had been realized and invested elsewhere. The tragedy of the commons is a standard economic theory. Individuals acting in their own self-interest deplete a shared resource. The bison bone trade is the perfect foreclosure of that theory. The resource was free. It belonged to no one and everyone. So it was taken by the first person with a wagon. There was no regulation, no license required. Just a strong back and a lack of squeamishness. The narrative of the American West is usually painted in gold and blood. It should be painted in calcium white. The survival of the pioneer class during the harsh decades of the 1870s and 80s was not a triumph of agriculture. It was a triumph of scavenging. They walked past the millions in profit that the living bison represented, the meat, the sustainable harvesting, and instead they capitalized on the ruins. It is a harsh lesson in the reality of frontier economics. Value is where you find it. If the land won't yield wheat, you harvest the debris of the past. You sell the skeletons, you turn the tragedy into a line item, and when the bones are gone and the soil is dead, you move on. That is the true mechanics of the Wild West. Not the duel at high noon, but the contract for 3,000 tons of calcium phosphate, signed, sealed, and delivered.